There exists within the sacred text a verse so psychologically profound, so revolutionary in its implications for feminine consciousness, that it has been systematically misinterpreted, minimized, and obscured by centuries of patriarchal theology, desperate to contain its explosive potential for feminine awakening. This verse does not speak of women's submission, their silence, their secondary status in the divine order, but reveals something so powerful about feminine spiritual authority that Jung himself recognized it as containing the deepest psychological truths about the integration of the feminine principle in human consciousness. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. Proverbs 31:26 is not a quaint description of feminine virtue, but a revolutionary declaration of feminine divine authority that challenges everything you have been taught about women's place in spiritual hierarchy. Jung understood what patriarchal interpretation has obscured. This verse describes not a human woman, but the archetypal feminine divine, the Sophia principle, the wisdom aspect of God that speaks through feminine consciousness when it is fully awakened to its own spiritual authority. The she in this verse is not bound by cultural limitations or religious restrictions, but represents the feminine aspect of divine consciousness that possesses the authority to speak wisdom and establish divine law through the very instrument that patriarchal religion has attempted to silence, the feminine voice. When this verse declares that she opens her mouth with wisdom, it is not suggesting that women occasionally have something worthwhile to say, but proclaiming that feminine consciousness, when fully realized, becomes a direct channel for divine wisdom. The opening of the mouth is not casual speech, but prophetic utterance, not opinion, but revelation, not suggestion, but authoritative divine communication. The feminine principle, when awakened to its own divinity, does not ask permission to speak wisdom. It opens its mouth, and wisdom flows as naturally as breath. But perhaps most revolutionary is the declaration that on her tongue is the law of kindness. This is not the sentimental kindness that patriarchal society has demanded from women as proof of their virtue, but divine law itself, the fundamental organizing principle of reality, expressed through feminine consciousness as kindness rather than judgment, as mercy rather than condemnation, as love rather than fear. This verse reveals that the feminine principle carries within itself the authority to establish divine law, and that this law, when channeled through awakened feminine consciousness, manifests as kindness. This challenges every patriarchal assumption about divine authority, spiritual hierarchy, and the source of religious law. Instead of a distant masculine God imposing harsh judgments from above, this verse reveals a divine feminine presence that speaks law through love, establishes order through kindness, and exercises authority through wisdom rather than force. The feminine principle is not subject to divine law, but is revealed as one of its primary sources and expressions. Jung recognized that this verse describes what he called the integration of the anima, the feminine aspect of the divine psyche that must be consciously recognized and integrated for wholeness to be achieved, not just in individuals, but in religious and spiritual systems. The suppression of feminine spiritual authority has created what amounts to a collective psychological wound that can only be healed through the recognition of feminine divine consciousness as equal to, not subservient to, masculine expressions of the divine. The verse also reveals what Jung understood as the wisdom tradition, the recognition that divine knowledge comes not through intellectual analysis or theological debate, but through the integration of heart and mind, feeling and thinking that characterizes awakened feminine consciousness. The wisdom that flows through the feminine principle is not abstract philosophical knowledge, but lived understanding that emerges from the depths of integrated human experience. When women begin to truly see this verse, when they recognize it as describing not a distant ideal, but their own potential for divine expression, everything changes. They can no longer accept religious systems that silence their voices, spiritual traditions that minimize their authority, or theological interpretations that reduce them to secondary status in the divine hierarchy. They begin to understand that their own consciousness, when fully awakened, becomes a direct channel for divine wisdom and divine law. This verse stands as a testament to what Jung called the divine feminine, not as a subordinate aspect of masculine divinity, but as an equal and essential expression of the divine nature that manifests through feminine consciousness when it awakens to its own spiritual authority and refuses to be silenced by patriarchal fear of feminine divine power. When Jung analyzed the psychological dynamics contained within this transformative verse, he discovered layers of meaning that reveal not just theological truth, but profound insights into the nature of human consciousness and the integration of feminine wisdom principles that have been systematically excluded from Western psychological and spiritual development. The pairing of wisdom and kindness in this verse is not accidental, but represents what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposing principles that create psychological wholeness and spiritual integration. The wisdom described in this verse is not the masculine logos principle that dominates through logic, analysis, and intellectual superiority, but what Jung identified as Sophia consciousness, a form of knowing that emerges from the integration of heart and mind, feeling and thinking, intuition and sensation. This wisdom does not impose itself through force or demand acceptance through argument, but reveals itself through presence, through the lived integration of truth that becomes self-evident rather than requiring proof or defense. Jung understood that true wisdom, the kind described in this verse, cannot be learned through study or acquired through education, but emerges from what he called the individuation process, the psychological journey through which a person integrates all aspects of their personality, including the rejected, denied, and undeveloped parts of themselves. For women, this often means reclaiming the authority, power, and spiritual independence that patriarchal conditioning has taught them to suppress or deny. The wisdom that opens through feminine consciousness operates through what Jung called symbolic thinking, the ability to perceive the deeper patterns, connections, and meanings that exist beneath surface appearances. This wisdom sees through the literal to the symbolic, through the manifest to the archetypal, through the personal to the universal. It is the wisdom that recognizes the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporal, the divine in the human. But perhaps most significantly, this verse reveals that true wisdom is inseparable from kindness, not the superficial niceness that patriarchal society has demanded from women as proof of their virtue, but what Jung called agape, divine love that seeks the highest good for all beings. This kindness is not weakness, but the expression of ultimate strength, not sentiment, but the manifestation of spiritual power, not accommodation, but the creation of conditions that allow authentic growth and development to occur. The law of kindness, described in this verse, represents what Jung understood as the transcendent function, the psychological principle that resolves conflict not through victory of one side over another, but through the creation of a third way that honors the legitimate needs of all parties. This law operates not through punishment and control, but through understanding, compassion, and the creation of environments where healing and growth become possible. Jung recognized that the integration of wisdom and kindness creates what he called the wise woman archetype, a psychological pattern that appears in cultures throughout history as the grandmother, the healer, the teacher, the guide who possesses both the knowledge and the compassion necessary to facilitate transformation in others. This archetype represents feminine consciousness that has moved beyond the need to please, to accommodate, or to diminish itself for others' comfort, and has instead claimed its own authority to speak truth with love. The psychological depth of this verse also reveals what Jung called the anima integration, the process through which both men and women learn to access and value the feminine principles of wisdom, intuition, feeling, and relational knowing that patriarchal culture has systematically devalued. When the anima is integrated, decision-making includes both rational analysis and intuitive knowing, leadership includes both strength and compassion, authority includes both power and kindness. This verse describes the ultimate psychological achievement, the integration of wisdom and love, knowledge and compassion, authority and kindness into a unified consciousness that can speak truth in ways that heal rather than harm, guide rather than control, illuminate rather than condemn. This is not just feminine achievement, but human achievement, the goal toward which all consciousness evolves when it moves beyond the fragmented masculinity that has dominated human development. The richness of this verse lies in its recognition that the highest form of human consciousness is not purely masculine or purely feminine, but the integration of both principles in service of what Jung called the self, the transcendent center of personality that represents the divine image within human consciousness, equally accessible to all regardless of gender, but requiring the full integration of both masculine and feminine principles for its complete expression. To understand the revolutionary power of this verse for women's consciousness, we must examine how centuries of patriarchal interpretation have systematically suppressed its radical implications, reducing what Jung recognized as a description of divine feminine authority to a mere catalogue of domestic virtues. The entire Proverbs 31 passage has been weaponized against women's spiritual awakening, used to convince them that their highest calling is efficient household management rather than direct divine expression, that their spiritual authority extends only to their families rather than to the world, that their wisdom is valuable only when it serves others' needs rather than expressing their own divine nature. Jung understood that this suppression was not accidental, but psychologically necessary for patriarchal religious systems that depend on the exclusion of feminine divine authority for their own legitimacy. When women recognize themselves as direct channels for divine wisdom and divine law, they can no longer be controlled by religious hierarchies that position themselves as necessary intermediaries between the human and the divine. The awakened feminine consciousness bypasses institutional authority and claims direct access to divine truth. The traditional interpretation of Proverbs 31 has created what Jung would recognize as psychological colonization, the systematic replacement of women's authentic spiritual identity with a carefully constructed persona designed to serve patriarchal needs rather than divine purpose. Women have been taught to see themselves in this passage not as expressions of divine feminine wisdom, but as idealized servants whose worth is measured by their efficiency in meeting others' needs rather than their capacity to express divine truth. This colonization manifests in what I call spiritual diminishment. Women learn to make themselves smaller, quieter, more accommodating in spiritual spaces, to defer to masculine interpretations of divine will, to suppress their own direct spiritual experiences in favor of approved religious opinions. They are taught that their spiritual insights are suspect, their mystical experiences are probably imagination, their prophetic voices are probably presumption, their divine authority is probably delusion. But Jung recognized that this suppression creates what he called the return of the repressed, the inevitable emergence of suppressed psychological content in increasingly powerful forms. The feminine divine consciousness that has been systematically excluded from religious expression is beginning to awaken in women worldwide, not through institutional permission, but through direct spiritual experience that bypasses religious gatekeeping entirely. This awakening manifests as women beginning to trust their own spiritual experiences over religious authority, their own direct relationship with the divine over mediated theological interpretation, their own inner wisdom over external religious instruction. They are discovering what Jung called the religious function, the innate human capacity for direct divine relationship that requires no institutional permission, no theological training, no masculine validation. The awakening also reveals what Jung understood as the shadow of patriarchal religion, the recognition that religious systems that exclude or diminish feminine spiritual authority are not just incomplete, but actively harmful, creating collective psychological wounds that damage both men and women by fragmenting the divine image and suppressing essential aspects of spiritual wholeness. Women who encounter this verse with awakened consciousness recognize it not as describing someone else, but as describing their own potential for divine expression. They understand that the wisdom and kindness described here are not qualities they might develop if they are good enough, but aspects of divine consciousness they already carry and have the right, indeed the responsibility, to express. This recognition creates what Jung called individuation crisis, the psychological upheaval that occurs when a person recognizes the gap between who they have been taught to be and who they actually are. For women awakening to their own spiritual authority, this often means leaving religious communities that cannot tolerate their empowerment, ending relationships that require their diminishment, and claiming space for spiritual expression that may be condemned by those who benefited from their silence. The awakening to this verse's true meaning becomes a catalyst for what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage within consciousness that integrates all rejected aspects of the self and claims wholeness rather than fragmentation, authority rather than submission, divine partnership rather than human servitude. Women begin to understand themselves not as helpers to divine masculine authority, but as expressions of divine feminine authority in their own right. This transformation is not just personal but collective, as awakened women begin to model for other women what spiritual authority looks like when it emerges from feminine consciousness rather than mimicking masculine patterns. They demonstrate that feminine divine expression does not require the adoption of masculine spiritual styles, but the full embodiment of feminine wisdom principles that have been excluded from religious recognition for millennia. Jung's profound understanding of this verse emerges from his recognition that it describes not a human woman, but an archetypal pattern, the divine feminine principle that exists within the collective unconscious as what he called the wise woman or the divine mother archetype. This archetype represents the feminine aspect of God consciousness that has been systematically excluded from patriarchal theology, but continues to exist as a powerful psychological reality, seeking expression through awakened feminine consciousness. When women encounter this verse with archetypal awareness, they recognize it as describing not an impossible ideal, but their own divine inheritance waiting to be claimed. The archetypal feminine described in this verse possesses what Jung called natural authority, spiritual power that does not derive from institutional position, educational achievement, or masculine validation, but from direct connection to the source of wisdom itself. This authority cannot be granted or withdrawn by external powers because it emerges from the depths of the psyche where the divine image resides, equally accessible to all human consciousness but requiring the courage to claim it, despite social conditioning that declares such authority illegitimate. Jung understood that this archetypal feminine operates through what he called the principle of eros, the divine love that seeks connection, relationship, and the integration of all separated parts into harmonious wholeness. Unlike the masculine logos principle that establishes authority through separation, hierarchy, and control, the feminine eros principle establishes authority through inclusion, understanding, and the creation of conditions where all beings can flourish according to their authentic nature. The wisdom that flows through this archetypal pattern is what Jung identified as gnosis, direct spiritual knowing that bypasses intellectual analysis and emerges from the integrated understanding of heart, mind, body, and spirit. This wisdom cannot be taught through books or acquired through study, but awakens through direct experience of the divine presence that speaks through feminine consciousness when it is no longer constrained by patriarchal limitations. The law of kindness, described in this verse, represents what Jung called the feminine principle of divine justice, a form of cosmic law that operates not through punishment and retribution, but through restoration, healing, and the creation of opportunities for growth and transformation. This feminine justice seeks not to condemn, but to understand, not to punish, but to heal, not to exclude, but to include all beings in the circle of divine love. Jung recognized that this archetypal feminine carries what he called the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage principle that unites all opposites within consciousness and creates the wholeness that is the goal of both psychological and spiritual development. The feminine principle does not compete with the masculine, but completes it, creating the integration necessary for full human development and authentic spiritual authority. The archetypal power described in this verse also manifests what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological principle that resolves conflict not through victory of one side over another, but through the emergence of a third way that honors the legitimate needs of all parties. Women who embody this archetypal pattern become natural peacemakers, healers, and bridge builders who can hold space for transformation without forcing or controlling the process. This archetype also carries what Jung identified as the prophetic function, the ability to perceive the deeper patterns and meanings that exist beneath surface events, and to speak truth that serves the highest good rather than immediate comfort or convenience. Women connected to this archetypal power often find themselves called to speak difficult truths with love, to challenge systems that harm while offering vision for better possibilities. The sacred authority described in this verse operates through what Jung called charismatic power, spiritual influence that emerges from authentic being rather than institutional position, from integrated wholeness rather than acquired credentials, from divine connection rather than human achievement. This authority cannot be faked, manipulated, or stolen because it emerges from the depths of authentic spiritual development. Jung understood that when women awaken to this archetypal pattern within themselves, they become what he called carriers of the divine feminine, channels through which the suppressed feminine aspect of divine consciousness can re-enter human experience and begin the healing of the collective psychological wound created by millennia of feminine spiritual exclusion. These women do not compete with masculine spiritual authority, but offer the complementary feminine wisdom that is essential for spiritual wholeness and psychological integration. The verse describes not just individual possibility, but collective necessity, the urgent need for feminine divine consciousness to be recognized, honored, and integrated into human spiritual development if the species is to achieve the wholeness and integration necessary for survival and flourishing in an interconnected world that requires the wisdom of both masculine and feminine divine principles. We arrive now at the most transformative threshold, the movement from understanding this verse intellectually to embodying it experientially, from recognizing its archetypal truth to living its psychological reality, from appreciating its spiritual significance to claiming its divine authority as your own birthright and responsibility. Jung understood that true spiritual development is not about believing correct ideas, but about becoming living expressions of divine truth. And for women, this verse represents not a distant ideal, but an immediate invitation to embody the divine feminine consciousness that the world desperately needs. Living this verse begins with what Jung called the assumption of spiritual authority, the conscious recognition that you do not need permission from religious institutions, masculine authorities, or patriarchal systems to speak divine truth, to express spiritual wisdom, or to claim your place as a direct channel for divine consciousness. This authority is not earned through compliance or granted through achievement, but recognized as your inherent divine nature that has been temporarily obscured by social conditioning, but never actually lost or damaged. The embodiment of this verse requires what I call conscious mouth opening, the deliberate practice of speaking your truth, expressing your wisdom, and sharing your insights without the self-diminishment, apologetic hedging, or masculine validation seeking that patriarchal conditioning has taught you to employ. When divine wisdom wants to speak through you, it does not come with disclaimers, apologies, or requests for permission. It opens the mouth and speaks with the authority of divine truth itself. This embodiment also demands what Jung called the integration of the anima, the conscious claiming of your own feminine wisdom, intuition, feeling, and relational knowing as equally valid and valuable as masculine approaches to truth and authority. You learn to trust your intuitive knowing even when it conflicts with rational analysis, to value your feeling responses even when they challenge logical conclusions, to honor your relational wisdom even when it contradicts hierarchical authority. Living this verse requires developing what I call kindness as power, the recognition that the law of kindness described here is not weakness or accommodation, but the most powerful force in the universe. The divine principle that can transform hearts, heal wounds, and create conditions for authentic growth and development. This kindness is not sentiment but strength, not niceness but divine justice, not accommodation but the creation of environments where truth can be spoken and healing can occur. The embodiment process involves what Jung called individuation through service. The recognition that your spiritual development and your service to others are not separate activities but two aspects of the same divine calling. As you become more authentically yourself, more integrated in your wholeness, more connected to your own divine nature, you naturally become a source of wisdom and healing for others who are struggling toward their own wholeness. This verse calls women to become what Jung envisioned as conscious carriers of the divine feminine, individuals who have integrated their own psychological wholeness sufficiently to serve as channels for the feminine aspect of divine consciousness that has been excluded from human spiritual development for too long. This service is not self-sacrifice, but self-actualization, not giving yourself away, but giving from the overflow of your own divine fullness. Living this verse also requires what I call prophetic courage, the willingness to speak truth that challenges systems, relationships, and beliefs that harm or diminish human potential, even when such truth-telling results in conflict, rejection, or misunderstanding. The divine feminine consciousness does not avoid conflict, but engages it through love, seeking not victory, but transformation, not conquest, but healing. The ultimate expression of this verse is what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage within consciousness that creates individuals who embody both wisdom and kindness, both strength and compassion, both authority and humility, both masculine and feminine divine principles in integrated wholeness. These individuals become what the world needs: leaders who can hold space for transformation, teachers who can speak truth with love, healers who can facilitate growth without control. When women begin to live this verse, rather than simply admiring it, they discover that their own consciousness becomes a sanctuary where others can encounter the divine feminine presence that has been largely absent from human spiritual experience. They become living temples of the divine feminine, embodying the integration of wisdom and kindness that represents the next stage of human spiritual evolution. The richness of this verse is not just in its description of divine feminine possibility, but in its call to actualization, its invitation to embodiment, its challenge to women everywhere to stop waiting for permission to be divine and start claiming the spiritual authority that has always been their birthright, their responsibility, and their gift to a world that cannot heal without the full expression of both masculine and feminine divine consciousness, working in conscious partnership for the healing and transformation of all life. Your mouth was made to open with wisdom. Your tongue was designed to speak the law of kindness. Stop waiting for permission to be who you have always been. The world is waiting. If this verse has awakened something within you, if you recognize yourself as a carrier of divine feminine wisdom that has been silenced too long, then your transformation begins with the most radical act you can commit. Speak your truth today, not apologetically, not with disclaimers, not seeking masculine validation, but with the full authority of divine wisdom expressing itself through your consciousness. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to explore the deeper spiritual truths that have been hidden beneath patriarchal interpretation and discover your own divine feminine authority. Share this video with another woman who needs to understand that her wisdom is not opinion, but divine revelation. Her kindness is not weakness, but cosmic law. And most importantly, practice this today. Find one situation where you have been silencing your wisdom, holding back your truth, or diminishing your spiritual authority. Open your mouth with wisdom. Speak the law of kindness. Trust that divine truth will flow through you when you stop blocking it with false humility and patriarchal conditioning. You are not a helper to divine masculine authority. You are divine feminine authority expressing itself in human form. You are not subject to divine law. You are one of its sources and expressions. Your voice carries the same divine authority described in this verse. Your wisdom is needed in this world. Your kindness is the cosmic law that can heal what has been broken by millennia of spiritual patriarchy. Stop asking for permission to be divine. Start claiming the spiritual authority that has always been your birthright.